Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on the area you're connecting with us. As Angel said, this is last of the series of presentation we had about indigenous communities in the region, especially those who are coming to the United States. And today's presentation is complex in the sense of, we want to discuss about Central America and South America, which in essence, there are some common things that you want to see during the presentation, but it also implies different realities and different contexts where the communities come from. I hope that we can go through this process and understand as much as we can about these communities and how complex the indigenous communities are in what we now know as Latin America. As you know, there are more than 40 million indigenous people in what is now known as Latin America, and it's a really multicultural, multinational, complex reality. Then our goals for today's presentation are, next please, is we will try to describe some cultural elements of the Nicaraguans, Peruvians, and Ecuadorians, who represent the 10 and 11 and 12 largest population of migrants to the United States. And also we will discuss about, certain aspect how they perceive any social, mental, and medical services that are provided to them outside their countries. And also what things we recommend to put in place if we want to provide services to this population. Next, please. First, let's start with Nicaragua. Nicaragua, as you know, is one of the countries in Central America. Central America composed by 7 different countries, but politically considered 5. Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica are the ones considered Central America politically. But physically, we include Belize and Panama because of the region. Now, Nicaragua is one of the, in extension, territorial extension, is one of the biggest countries in Central America and one of the poorest too in the region. The population by July 2020 is almost 6.5 million of people in Nicaragua. Also, in recent statistics, the 50% consider themselves Roman Catholics, 33% consider themselves Protestants, and 1% non-religious. It's interesting, this information, because I will mention some of these ahead respect to the religion, which is interesting for the indigenous communities. The literacy rate is in general 82%, even though in the early 80s it was considered around 90, 95, 96%. Now the rate is considered 82%. Next, please. Now, Nicaragua in particular, 69% of the population are considered mestizo. And when we refer as a mestizo, is a mixed indigenous and European. European, those who came to invade the land, in the 1500s. Then that mix between the indigenous and those Europeans become mestizos. 9% are considered Afro-descendants and 5% are considered indigenous. And what is common in the countries that we will discuss today is that most of the population information that coming from the nation state consider the majority mestizos, when in reality the indigenous population most likely are higher than what they consider, and different organizations have that dispute those percentages in population. I will explain more about that during the presentation. Main indigenous nations in Nicaragua, and when I refer to nations, I mentioned in previous presentation that usually in the United States, you hear about tribal tribes. In what is known as Latin America, we don't consider tribes, we consider nations. And as a nations, we have that negotiation between nation to nation with the nation state established by the mestizos. Those indigenous nations that are most bigger in Nicaragua, the Chorotega, los Cacaoperas o Matagalpas, Ocanishu o Situaba, los Náhuatl, Misquitos, Sumo, Bañagna, and Rama. Those are the biggest indigenous nations in Nicaragua. And as you can see in the map, and I will explain now why you see a more concentration in the Atlantic coast in Nicaragua than the Pacific. Now, most of the Nahuatl are more around the Great Lake of Managua or Nicaragua. That's dark that you see really big is one of the biggest lake in the region, and is around that where most of Nahuas are located. And I will explain that difference a little bit. Next, please. Now, in this map, you can see the different departments, or you can call it, like counties. If you're from a state, the different counties that are in each state. In Nicaragua, if you remember, Nicaragua is known for the Somoza dictatorship and how the Frente Sandinista in 1979, took the power from the dictatorship. And then the other part that is important to remember is usually most people my age at least will remember how Reagan started the Contra fight against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Then after 1979, United States is starting to train and finance Contras who were ex-National Guard member from the Somoza government. However, in many regions where indigenous community live, also indigenous is starting to get against the Frente Sandinista. Around that context is when these regions established. In 1987, the Sandinista government with other international bodies from the UN, UNESCO, and others sit with the communities, and they first recognize Creoles and Garifunas, who are considered Afro-descendants, but they consider themselves, yes, mixed with the Africans, but also with indigenous and created in that region. And they were recognized as ethnic groups. Now, they are not considered Afro-descendants, they are considered ethnic groups, and that's why the name are Creole and Garifuna. Now, you remember in previous presentations, I explained the Garifunas are not only in Nicaragua, but also in Honduras, Guatemala, and Belize. Then they are extensively around the coastal area in the Atlantic coast. Also in 1987, within those conversations, those negotiations, the government agreed with indigenous communities to create autonomous regions in the north and the south. In the map, you can see the yellow, clear yellow region, autonomous region in the Atlantic and North Atlantic, and the other one in the South Atlantic. Those are where more the concentrations of indigenous communities are, and they represent almost one third. It's like 33% of the territorial of Nicaragua is under those autonomous regions. According to that agreement, the indigenous communities will have control of the territories. They can maintain their culture, language, and also their traditional authorities. That means that they elect by their own customs, their own authorities. They have all the autonomy to decide law, to do justice, and decide how they can use the resources. That was the agreement in 1987. Which was an advance because most of these indigenous communities, especially Mosquitos, were fighting against the Sandinista government. And after that, that was like the end of that armed conflict against the Sandinistas in those regions. However, by around, after the Sandinista lost the elections in the 90s and the opposition government of Violeta Chamorro came in, those agreements were not clearly respected, and indigenous communities starting to have that confrontation with the government, which continue now. In 2000, under Ortega's government also, the government developed what they call a parallel government structures for those autonomous regions will diminish their autonomy and also the way they follow, their own traditions. Then a lot of these parallel governments are in favor of companies that go and destroy jungles and forests, which in those regions are really the biggest ecological regions in Nicaragua. And now that's part of the destruction that industry that the actual government is supporting against the indigenous communities. Next, please. Next slide, please. Then, as you can imagine, higher rates of poverty are between Afro descendants and indigenous compared to the mestizo population in Nicaragua. And again, it's understandable the mestizo is a concept that it's widely promoted, but it's not totally true. Now, the most recent, and when I said, the situation about destruction and the destruction of the forests, the jungles, and all the ecosystems in those autonomous regions, those are the main causes for indigenous and Nicaraguans to leave the country. And the most recent information that we have is that May 8, 2019, two big organizations on the defense of human rights and the rights of the indigenous communities, the Norms International, that there's a lot of violence against indigenous and Afro descendants because of these transnational companies generate a lot of resistance, and the repression of the government or private security forces create that kind of violence that made people starting to think about to leave the regions where they live. The other important thing that is happening, like I said, in the part of the religion, most of the indigenous communities in Nicaragua are considered either Catholic or Protestants, but not pure Catholic or Protestants. For example, Mosquitos has influence from Protestant churches from Europe, and a lot of the Mosquitos also speak English. Then they had a combination of their own traditional beliefs with that of the Christian that was influenced by them. Then all the celebrations, they mix that, and that's what we call it syncretism. And the syncretism is present in all indigenous communities in Nicaragua. Then when they do celebrations, they had both the indigenous culture plus the Christian combined. And that's why sometimes people confuse things when they don't understand. For example, for the Garifuna and for the Mosquitos, the dance is it's not just dance to enjoy, but also is for traditional purposes. You know, they heal, they celebrate their ancestors through their dance. Then those are scenes that they even do it in the church. Then those scenes are important to remember when you work with Nicaraguans. Also, a lot of these new Protestant churches are contributing to support the extraction companies, and most people believe that these new, Protestant churches coming to these areas are supported by those extractive companies, international extractive companies. Next, please. Now, Ecuador. It's Ecuador is in South America. As you can see, the dark dot is Ecuador is between Peru and Colombia. And here is a different, different situation in the sense of region and culture. The population for Ecuador is almost 17 million. 64.2 are considered to be urban settings, and the biggest concentration urban people are in Guayaquil and Quito, which are the two biggest cities in Ecuador. Guayaquil was in the past the capital of the country, the nation state, and later was established in Quito. The literacy rate at this moment, and let me tell you this, the literacy rate is more focused on urban settings than rural areas. It's considered the female 92% are literate and males 93.8%. Now remember, these literacy rates is based on age too. Those 15 and older are considered within this rate, not rate, but older people maybe the rates are different, probably lower. In the case of the Ecuadorians, 74% consider themselves Roman Catholics, 11 consider themselves Protestants, and 8% atheists or agnostics. Next, please. Now, in Ecuador, 71.9% are considered mestizo of that population. Indigenous are 7% are considered indigenous. European, and that's Europeans from the Iberian Peninsula, most likely 7%. Afro-descendants 4.3%, mulattoes 1.9%, and black 1%. Now, why we have that difference between Afro-descendant mulattoes and black is because it's how people consider themselves in their census. Those who consider themselves Afro-descendants, they consider themselves mixed, but not with Europeans, but more between Afro-descendants and indigenous people. Mulattoes are those who consider themselves mixed between European and Afro-descendants, and blacks are those who believe they are really black descendants, but they don't like to call themselves Afro-descendant, but black. That's why you see that disparities in the percentages. However, again, in this case, also a lot of organizations, especially indigenous organizations, dispute those percentages because, and I will explain later why I said that about the mestizos versus indigenous. Languages, in the case of Ecuador, we have the 93% speak Spanish. There are 4.1% who speak Quechua, and 0.7% include different indigenous languages. Now, in the case of Ecuador, like like I explained in Nicaragua, also we talk about nations, indigenous nations. Then indigenous nationalities are divided in 3 regions in what is Ecuador: the coast, the mountain, and the Amazon area. In each of those areas, there's different number of nationalities concentrated. Next, please. Now, as you can see in the map, you see the different regions that I was mentioning to you. They are considered nationality because each nationality maintains their own language and culture. Greater number of them also maintain their traditional clothes, and they have education and different interventions in the society. You know, we have from those who cannot read and write in Spanish, only in their language, to those who are professional, who are business people, who have, you know, degrees and have different, you know, participation in society. But they continue maintaining the language and their culture. 21.4% of the indigenous people representing in 10 nationalities, or 10 nations, live in the Amazon region, which is in the map, as you see it, is in the part that is going side away from the blue, that is the Pacific coast. That's the Amazon region, and a lot of nationalities live there. In the Andean region, which is more on the center of the map, the Ecuador, and you see a lot of figures there, concentration, 7.4% are considered Quechua, which are the biggest indigenous, not the only one, but the biggest one in that region, and 8.3% in the coastal area. And you see far in the blue, there's a figure by the Galapagos Islands too. The indigenous people there are less concentrated, but is still a great present, especially in Galapagos Island. Then officially the constitution of the Ecuador recognized 14 indigenous nationalities in Ecuador at this moment. At the same, like in Nicaragua, I forgot to say that when they made the agreement, it was a reform in the constitution too, to recognize officially the indigenous communities. Next, please. Now, in the case of the Amazon region, there's several indigenous communities, but Los Shuar are the biggest nation there, followed by the Aikofan, the Shiwa, the Sikopai, Siona, and Zapata are the biggest groups in the Amazon region. It depends where they are located. Shuars are more widespread around the Amazon towns. And in the coast, you know, there's several nations too, but the most numerous one, and when people goes and visit Ecuador, will hear about are the Eperas and Manta in the coastal area. Now, in Ecuador, as you know, has been several situations that cause migration. Part is, you know, the discrimination that continue, the poverty levels, and also the government favor transnational companies that extract oil, destroy the jungle in the Amazon region especially, and in the Andean regions with the mines. Next, please. Then within that situation, there has been important things that we need to remember to have a context of what's going on in Ecuador. Ecuador, the biggest indigenous organization, CONAIN, is called CONAIN, you know, has a different communities are part of that CONAIN. One is the biggest. And historically, CONAIN has been the front fighter in justice for not only indigenous communities, but for the whole Ecuadorian population. And then when the government, right now, the government is Lenin Moreno, he was the vice president with Korea, and Korea administration was for a long time supported by all indigenous communities because he provide, different things and maintain all the regulations that previous administration has in favor of indigenous communities and the poor people in Ecuador. However, when Moreno took power, he changed completely from what Korea was doing, and he started to negotiate with IMF, and he is starting to provide open completely with no restrictions to extractions of oil, gas, and mines. Then the Guaranis is one of the groups in the Amazon that was unknown until late 50s, 1950s. It was the first contact that a non-Indian has with the Guaranis, and they live in the region of the Amazon jungle. Then previous administration is starting to allow oil companies to go and starting to extract oil, destroy the jungle in the Amazon. Then the indigenous Guaranis in help with other organizations, indigenous organizations in Ecuador is starting to fight. And finally, that region of the Amazon where they live was considered a ecological reserve, which the new government Moreno didn't put attention on or didn't really like to respect. And the extractions starting to begin with the destruction of the jungle. They fight to the core, and the Supreme Court of Ecuador in 2019 allowed them to say that they were right. They need to stop oil extractions from their territories because it's an ecological reserve, and diseases are coming to these communities. That was a really exceptional win for indigenous communities in Ecuador. And that doesn't mean that it really completely stopped. But it was at least in the legal system a win that usually is not common in Ecuador. And within that context, also in August 2019, the indigenous coalitions, CONAI and the biggest ones, broke all the collaboration they had with the government because Moreno started to implement austerity measures in favor of IMF recommendations. And those affect not only indigenous community, but also workers and the poor people from mestizos in Ecuador. Then by October, there was some unrest, social unrest. A lot of indigenous people were coming to Quito, to the capital of the Ecuador, and that was so-called October Insurrections. It was almost for a couple of weeks. The indigenous people were, fighting against the government, asking the resignation of Moreno. And what is called October Insurrection was because historically, CONAI, for example, has been in the front line to depose 3 presidents in Ecuador, and they were pressuring Moreno to resign too, until he negotiated with indigenous organizations. It made an agreement of change the policies, the austerity policies that he was pursuing, and that create like an agreement between them to stop what they call an insurrection. There was more, an unrest in Quito. During that time, also Moreno moves the government from Quito to Guayaquil to protect himself and starting to declare the national emergency, mobilizing the police and the army. Then those situations creates a lot of migration too, in different populations in Ecuador because of the economic situation, and also this unrest situations in society. That has not been changing a lot, and with the COVID-19 that usually I don't mention in my presentations, COVID-19 come to in help of Moreno. Even though a lot of communities in Ecuador have been affected by the COVID-19 in this moment, the government is still in power, and the next election is next year for president. Okay, next please. Peru. Peru is also in South America and is between, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, and Colombia, as you can see in the green. And the population for Peru is almost 32 million people. 70.3% are considered urban, in urban setting. The biggest three cities in Peru that were more concentration of people is Lima, Arequipa, and Trujillo. That doesn't mean there's no other biggest cities, but these are the most concentrated with people. The literacy rate is considered for female 91% and male 97%. 60% of Peruvians consider themselves Roman Catholics, 14.6% Protestant, and 4% considering themselves non-religious. Next, please. Now, in Peru, 60.2% are considered mestizo, 25.8% indigenous, 5.9% European descendants, 3.6% Afro-descendants, and 1.2% other that include those descended from Japanese and Chinese communities. 82.9% speak Spanish, 13.6% Quechua, 1.6% Aymara, 0.3% Ashaninka, and 0.8% other indigenous languages that include Amazons, one. Like Ecuador, Peru has an Amazon region, an Andean region, and coastal region too. Next, please. Now, by the Constitution, Peru, it's considered as a multinational, multicultural, multilingual nation state. There are 55 indigenous nationalities recognized officially. Some others said there are 57, but officially there's 55 recognized nationalities, 48 different languages, which are original languages that were spoken even before the European invasion and have been keeping during all, more than 500 years after the invasion is still spoken in Peru. 83.11% of those indigenous nationalities speak Quechua, 1092 Aymara, 167 Ashaninka, and 4.31 indigenous from the Amazon. And I want to explain a little bit about this because Quechua is like the lingua franca that you see in regions like Mexico and Central America, where now what was the lingua franca that was speaken as a way to communicate between indigenous communities. In Peru, Quechua is used by most of Andean people, but also other indigenous communities. The way they used to communicate between each other is through the Quechua. And also the government, when negotiating with indigenous communities, use Quechua as a language for diplomacy. Then that's why I said, the French in diplomacy in European context is the Quechua for the Europeans. Now, but still, there is high rates of poverty. It's common between indigenous communities. They possess the almost 50%, like you see in the map, 49.6% of the national territory is where indigenous communities live, and they try to maintain that balance with the ecosystem. The biggest challenge, that they confront are transnational companies, mines, oil and gas, and also destruction of the jungles. Those are continue to be, like in Ecuador, the same situation for the Peruvians too. Because most of the biodiversity, um, in not only in Peru but in the whole region, is where indigenous people live. Next, please. Now, Peru, and this is not only for Peru, but also is common in Ecuador and Nicaragua and other countries. Indigenous people are not considered first-class citizens. They are considered like backward, like people who don't want to support progress, because the indigenous communities have a respect for the earth, has a respect for life. Then they want to maintain harmony relationship with the nature, and because of that, modern nation states consider them groups that are against progress. And progress means for these governments and the mentality of the occidental mentality to destruct, extract everything from earth. Oil, you need oil, gas, minerals, gold, whatever you can extract and make money. It doesn't matter what you destroy. That's what is considered progress for this government. That's why they always said, and this was evidenced because in Peru, especially, um, like I mentioned in previous presentations, when someone asked me about, how to call people, in some other areas of Latin America, you hear the word Indio, and Indio is an insult. It's a way to insult someone when you call it Indio. In Peru and Ecuador, you're gonna hear more the term cholo, or that's the cholada, or they are choleando. Those means indigenous, Indians. Like this is similar. Then it's an insult between them, and that's how they call most of the indigenous people. In the second government of Alan Garcia, in Peru, he, in the first government that he has when he was younger, he was more a social democrat. The second term in early 200, mid 200, 2000, sorry, 2000, he was more like neoliberal. He's starting to, he caused a lot of crisis, indigenous people rise in defense of their territories, and they took, highways, and there were some clashes with the police. Police officers were killed, indigenous people were killed. It was a whole turmoil that happened until he decided to negotiate with indigenous communities. But during that period of time, he in national television said that indigenous people are not first-class citizens. That's the one who said, these people are ignorant and they are not even first-class citizens. And for him, they had no right to ask no respect or boundaries, in their territories. Then after those negotiations, still by last year, still the core system is still going on with indigenous leaders trying to put them in jail for life. That has been suspended, I guess, for the COVID emergency too. But most of the problems that happen right now is the illegal mines and destruction in the Amazon is affecting and creating a lot of challenges for indigenous communities. During this pandemic, indigenous communities closed their territories, and the government was agreed to allow them no, Vizcarra president is the president right now. He allowed the communities to close to prevent because testing and also medical services are not available for indigenous communities. Then the problem with the situation when they trying to close their communities is, of course, the basic things are not going into those communities too. Now, in 2019, because of the different conflicts against the extractions, mines and oil, gas, in different regions, these companies and also, most people believe the government assassinate several leaders in the Amazon and Andean region. Then, most likely, this situation have been continued and creates a lot of migration from these countries too, and from Peru. Now, one parenthesis I want to do in this is the pandemic is affecting indigenous communities. There are communities where, for example, there are like 100 or something families in that community, and if someone got infected, they don't have really any help from the government, and some communities are in risk to disappear. If they are affected by the COVID-19 and they got sick and die, most likely those communities will disappear. And that's happened also in Ecuador, is worry about Ecuador. Now, indigenous community trying to use their own traditional, natural medicine through herbs and different ways that they had, trying to control that. But still, governments in Peru, Ecuador, and also Nicaragua doesn't provide medical or social services assistance with basic food to indigenous communities. That's something that I think after this pandemic, the curve goes down, we will start seeing more immigration from these countries too, because of the economic reasons and all of that, that have been happening during this time. Next, please. Then part of what I wanna, before I go to these, I wanna say is that when I refer to the mestizos and disparities with indigenous communities, is because these countries, even though they recognize in their constitution, officially they recognize they are multinational, they tend to undercount those communities that benefits to the nation states to, use resources the way they want. When an indigenous person goes into the cities and for some reason they stop speaking the language or they don't use the traditional clothes, they are not considered indigenous, they are considered mestizos, even though they are indigenous. When young people who's go to the cities for their university degrees, and they starting to not only speak Spanish but also other languages like Italian or English, they are considered no longer indigenous. Then those numbers, that's why are really not realistic in the sense, because it's more like how the nation states consider or establish people in which race or ethnic group. Then the other important thing, now they are going to explain the coming to the United States of these three different communities. In case of Ecuador and Peru, the most common countries they migrate is Spain first, Italy second, and third United States. For the Nicaraguans, most likely they're gonna go to different other countries within Central America, and then in Mexico, and then they're gonna come to the United States. However, Nicaraguans are considered the 12th largest populations of migrants living in the United States. And as you remember in previous presentation, I said here, United States give us a label of Latina, Latino, or Hispanics, that most indigenous people don't recognize. But except, in Ecuador and Peru, they call it Hispanics to the mestizos, by the way, they call it the Hispanic. They said los hispanos, that's when they're referring to the mestizos. It's an interesting thing, because it's a language connotation, definition of ethnic group through language. Latino, Hispanic is that. Then they constitute the 12th largest population in comparison to the Mexican that are the biggest one. And also since 2000, we have seen an increase in the number of Nicaraguans coming to the United States. From 2000 to 2017, the increase has been really great. As you can see in what I'm presenting, the group in the United States, living here in the United States, have been really more, especially those foreign born, those who born in Nicaragua coming to the United States. Then that's the reality that we have with the Nicaraguans, and most likely some of you will be able to meet some of these Nicaraguans in the United States. Now, remember, most of Nicaraguans, even though they speak their native language, they can speak Spanish, and younger people will be able to read and write also in Spanish and in their language. That's part of what's characteristics of the Nicaraguans especially. Next, please. Ecuadorians are the 10th largest population of the migrants here in the United States in relation to the Mexicans again. And again, in 2000, we saw a high increase, higher than Nicaraguans here in the United States. And foreign born too grew up so much. And most likely is due to what I was explaining about the social unrest that caused economic strength, the policies that the government has against the majority of the people, and that's caused a lot of migration, And as you remember, Ecuadorians and Peruvians really use the United States as a third country to go, not the first choice, but still we have an increase in numbers here in the United States from 2000 to 2017. Next, please. Now, Peruvians are the 11th largest population. And again, it's the same pattern, because of the economic situation, extraction, and all of that conflicts that are in Peru. Poverty levels, discrimination to indigenous people, like I said, even though these countries recognize officially as a multinational, multilingual countries, they still have discrimination against indigenous people. Then most of the reason indigenous will leave these countries are because of the discrimination, because of lack of social and medical services, and different things, poverty levels are high between them. And that's why from between 2000 2017, we're starting to see an increase in Peruvians, especially Peruvian born, coming to the United States, as you can see in the slide. Next, please. Then what recommendation we can give working with indigenous people? Sorry. It is important, like in previous presentation I've been discussing, that we need to be sensitive to distinguish indigenous people from others, migrants from the different countries. They could be Peruvians, they can be Ecuadorians, Nicaraguans, but they're gonna have their own indigenous identity. A Miskito will call himself Miskito, not Nicaraguan first. they're gonna say, yes, I'm a mosquito from Nicaragua, but first it's a mosquito. In the case of indigenous communities in Ecuador and Peru is going to be the same. They will say which community they come in, with nation first, then the nation, because that's how the identity is established. They're going to bring the culture, they're going to bring their own ways to see the world. And that's why it is important to distinguish. Even though they speak Spanish, they will not feel comfortable that you identify them as a Latinos, Latinas, or Hispanics. Also, we need to be sensitive to the language and cultural barriers. You know, as I said, indigenous people come with their own culture to wherever they go. And sometimes when we don't have that open mind, we don't understand what the cultural norms are between them and their own process to deal with mental health issues and physical illness too. Also, it's important to understand the deep trauma the indigenous migrant experience, not only in their country, you know, because like I explained, in their country they are considered not a first-class citizens in all of these countries. Indigenous people are suffering discrimination. Indigenous people suffer lack of different services. Then they had that deep trauma. The way they come to the big cities, they are discriminated all the time. They are put aside or invisibilized in their own countries, whether they are majority. That's why when people goes to the cities and establish in the cities, they tend to take off their traditional clothes and don't speak their language, but the Spanish, and that's why they become invisible and become more mestizo. You know, in Peru is interesting because in Peru most indigenous people doesn't have a curl hair. One way that they do it is they curl their hair to look more like mestizo. Then it is important to understand that trauma that comes with they belong and have that experience with mestizos in their country. And when they travel, you know, they has to go through either through, for example, Ecuadorians and Peruvians use a lot of, you know, the ocean, you know, to travel, not through the frontiers, but took a lot. You know, those are cargo ships. They are not cruise. They use, and it's really for several days when they don't have hygiene, anything. You know, then it's a trauma for them to go through. And as many indigenous migrants too, if they go through the frontiers, they're gonna suffer different sins, discrimination, rape, violence. Then when they come to the United States, they will, you know, confront other things. You know, those who are considered themselves Latinos or Hispanics here in the United States will not understand them, and they will say, "Why are you from Peru and you cannot speak Spanish like me?" You know, when you need to remember that indigenous people learn the dialect of Spanish that is in the region where they live. One example is, for example, when you talk about public transportation, we call it bus here in English, but in Latin America, you can call it, you know, camión, colectivo, guagua, or bus. You know, the same thing with different words because it's depending on what dialect of the Spanish you learn. Then there's going to be different things that they're going to express that other people will not understand, or they will not understand when people speak. That's why it's important to see that that's part of great trauma of the people when they come to the United States too. In general, also because of their experience in their own country, they don't trust Occidental medical, mental, or social providers. They will not be open to go to the different services unless they have some trust with your programs. not because you're offering the greatest services, they're going to be willing to come voluntarily because they don't trust in their own country those services, even though they didn't have it. And when they have it, they don't trust them. When they come to the United States, also, they will not be comfortable, not even with the school system, too. Next, please. Then, as you know, because of that lack of services, most indigenous people look for traditional healers to resolve medical and mental concerns. Healers are, they're mental health providers. They are the counselors, and also they are the doctors. Then, like in many other indigenous communities, there are specialties between the healers, and they will look for those people within their own communities before they go and ask for services to organizations that provide mental medical services in the United States. Next, please. Then my recommendation is to be cultural humble. What this means is usually here in the United States, the hegemony of the society try to impose what is right and what is wrong culturally. And we need to be humble in that sense that people comes with their own culture, values, with their own traditions. And even if we don't understand, we need to be humble to say, wait a minute, let me be, put aside my prejudice or any other concept that I have and learn what they bring. Because if you're not able to do that, you will not be able to create that trust with those communities you want to work. Also, by looking at someone, you cannot assume who they are. Like I said, it's important to understand that some of them are Afro-Indigenous people too, from Nicaragua, Ecuador, and Peru. Some are going to consider themselves just blacks, but you need to ask them how they want to be called. It's simple as saying how they identify themselves because that's the way they're going to start feeling that you have some kind of respect to them as a human being, which is not common in the countries of origin. You need to identify also local communities that work with them or have been created by those communities who come previously, because normally migrants goes to where there's some history. They know there's people from their own towns or relative has been in certain areas in the United States. They will tend to go there because it's where they're gonna find familiar voices and faces. And that's why it is important to see those community organizations, hometown networks that they form, and the churches. As you know, they the syncretism create that connection with different churches, Catholic, Protestant. Then those churches gonna be always concentration of people going because they need that part of the support. And you can find those. And also when you identify healers, traditional healers, it's important to go and connect with them, and that's where you're gonna get more trust from those communities. And the development of intercultural projects is important because intercultural means that we are not trying to impose the culture that we have in the United States, but to mediate and understand the culture they bring to enrich us, and also how can we, in that enrichment together, we can work within those values and those traditions. Then intercultural projects are important, and one important way is what we mentioned previously in others presentation, promotoras or promotores project. United Nations developed these in the 1980s, and a lot of communities are familiar with promotores, promotoras, because those are people who are from the community that are trained and specialized in certain specific scene that they can guide them to provide services. If you hire, for example, translators, it would be better if it's from those specific communities. You train those translators, you hire them, you have as a staff, and they can provide that neutral way to communicate, find the ways and words that they can use to get familiar with what you're talking about, providing mental, medical, social services to the communities. Also, it is important to recognize that healing is not just a pill or an injections, but could be from different natural ways and traditions and also ceremonies. Then when you develop intercultural projects, you use healers in at the same level of the Occidental providers, that will be more acceptable for the communities, and for indigenous people to trust you and come and provide, that you will provide a service that is um, more respectful to their beliefs and what they bring to the society. It is important to engage the richness of the culture and language they bring to the United States, and how that can enrich also our own experience as a human beings working with indigenous communities. Then that's what I have today. I know it's been really, these are so much information that we can provide, but in a short period of time, I'm trying to cover 3 different countries. And I hope that if you have any questions, I'm open to questions right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier, for all that information. We actually have 2 questions right now for here. Uh, the first one is, how do indigenous people of South and Central America view mental health through their practices? I struggle with this because I myself, as a Mexican, practice many indigenous traditions as part of my mental health, but I'm also a social worker professionally who does a lot of therapeutic work with Latinx community, and I feel like my work is important, but might not be important for indigenous people. Hope my questions make sense.
Yeah, I think it is a great question and a great comment too from the person who wrote that question. Because, like I said in the beginning, first we need to understand the indigenous communities are not homogeneous. Not because I'm an indigenous person, I have the same traditions of the other indigenous people. And like I said, in what we call it right now, Latin America, southern border from Mexico to down to Chile and Argentina, there are 40 million indigenous people living in that biggest region. And even indigenous communities here in the United States recognize that they go to Latin America to learn ways to become more indigenous. You know, I had that experience with other sisters and brothers from here, from the United States. And the traditions are complex and different, and what for some, like I said, could be an understanding, and this person who mentioned the Mexican tradition, a curandero in the Mexican tradition will depend on which indigenous tradition coming, will use different words and different rituals to treat certain sin that is going to be different from the Maya, or is going to be different from the Quechua, from the Aymara, or from the Amazon. The Amazons are completely different in that sense. Then we cannot have a homogeneous view. And for example, if we call it susto, that concept could be common, in communities, but not necessarily the same treatment or the same way that they perceive it. Then it is important to ask them what what the concept they have, and what they usually, know is the way they treat it, especially mental health. Remember, mental health, indigenous communities don't deny mental health issues. However, they don't look for the Occidental counselors to do it, because they have the healers in their communities that use, what in certain communities we call it the plática, or the conversation. It's like a therapy session, where people open up and say, this is the situation, and the healer explore the different reasons, but they go also with their own tradition, how they see that the influence of different things, in nature, in their families, in the surrounds that cause that situation. And based on that, they prescribe a treatment. And in most of the time in their communities work, people get well. Then when they come to the cities, if they are coming from the jungle, from the Andean regions, they come into a complete different environment. The city is a complete different. Now, when we talk about Mexicans or Central Americans who are more just to the big cities, that's different. But from people who come in from more rural areas and is different, then my recommendation will be it's good to learn and respect, why they believe and how they perceive the mental or medical issues that they have, any ailment that they consider, and based on that, ask them what they usually do at their communities, how they go solving this. And based on that, you can start, not just learning, but at the same time looking for, like I said, partnership with healers at the community, and provide from your own perspective, also from their own perspective, together to do a more holistic way to provide service to indigenous communities will be better, because nobody will be able to have, the knowledge of all the traditions. I have my own tradition. I respect some others, but when someone tell me, "Oh, I'm coming from this community and this is the way we do it," I will look for that healer to help, because my way probably is not their way. Then, unless the person is willing to follow what I understand in my way, and they are willing to do that, that's different. But it's better we coming from asking them first. Ask them how they call it, how they traditionally in their communities heal that, and we will learn a lot from that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. We have another question over here. Is there any program to learn Quechua in the U.S.?
Um, I know online there's you can Google. There are several Quechua, different indigenous, more biggest in that sense, indigenous lessons of the languages. However, here in the United States, I don't know, especially Quechua, I don't have any idea, but I know you can Google and check different things. I know in the different countries, there are YouTube, for example, have videos of people teaching Quechua, Aymara. Those are things that you can start, understand it. However, if Quechua and Aymara or any other indigenous people is not your language, my recommendation for you to try to communicate with them in your own language, and until you get some trust, then you can start saying, "Oh, I'm learning these words are correct," and they can help you to improve in the language. Don't try to speak in the language, in the beginning, because for some people, now speaker is someone is speaking now with me in the first time they see me, I'm not gonna feel comfortable, because I don't know who they are and why you speaking to me in that way. Um, and some people will feel not comfortable if you speak in their language, but it's a good idea to learn in the sense of at least you can start understanding some of the words that are using. Also, the other part is when you look at those from their countries, Ecuador or Peru, Bolivia, those lessons are better because they had also culture. When you're trying to learn a language only in the mechanics, it's not the same. For example, I learned, I've received English outside the United States, But to me, it was more a mechanic thing, I never really get it until you come into, the language this language is more common. Then you understand certain things that outside will make no sense to you. And I know that you can understand it. You go to England too. There are things that they use that you don't understand because it's a different culture. That's the same with the indigenous languages. It's not just said hello, good morning, just simply in the language. It's to understand the different ways that you communicate with people, depending on is the elder, is someone with the same age, or is someone younger. Many indigenous language has different ways to communicate with people. And if we don't understand that cultural part, the mechanics of the language is so simple that is not going to help. That's why I say, try to use a translator when you speak the first time with someone in their indigenous language, or try to use it later in the process of communicating with them. And if they feel comfortable that you said something in their language, then they will accept it in a different way. I don't know if that's what they.
Excellent. Thank you, Javier. Another question over here is, what are good questions to ask to learn about the belief and practices of our clients?
Wow, that's a really complex question.
Yes.
I think we need to, you know, take in consideration what is the reason they are approaching your services. Um, why they are trying to connect with you, or who refer them to you, and what is the reason. And based on that is when you start in, the dialogue with the person. First, you need to understand, and simple questions are, how you identify yourself, first. Based on that, you can say, what is the reason you're here, or how can I help you, and they can tell you, this is the reason why I'm here. Then based on that, you can start establishing, okay, this is, if they had a questions, more any illness, how they perceive the illness, how for them is, and how they believe your services will help them. Remember, it's not our agenda when we're trying to provide services to the communities. It's more where they coming from and what is their concept. My experience has been that sometimes when people don't want to provide some services, they refer it to the next person. In a previous presentation, I mentioned one of my experience working with one organization. I was the only indigenous person in that organization, and a Zapotec family came and they said, oh, they don't speak Spanish, go and talk to them. I don't speak Zapotec, and because I'm an indigenous, that doesn't mean I speak all the languages, or I have a way to understand the different cultures too. Then the best way is to trying to understand why they're coming, who referred to them, and for what reason. And you can ask them, and like I said, it's better to use translators. Um, Now, those families who has people born here, probably the parents are foreign born, but they come here and they have children. Some of those children speak English, or speak Spanish, but most likely English. You know, like for example, in Nicaragua, like I said, mosquitoes, younger mosquitoes prefer to speak English. Then when they come here to the United States, they speak English, British English, but English. Then that's something that you can explore, even though it's not recommended that you use the children's or relatives to translate, at least to get the basic information in the first session will be a good idea that you can ask them, because it's better to understand why they are coming to you, what services they are looking for, and how can you provide um, the best environment for them to come back to you. Because if you don't provide that openness and understanding in the first one, in the first encounter, most likely they will not continue looking for you, coming to you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Javier. Another question here in the question section is, my question is about working with children of indigenous parents who have been born in the U.S. Do you have any experiences or advice about how to balance their parents' culture and language with the culture and language they've been born into in the U.S.? Hope this makes sense.
Yes, definitely. That's I work with young people for many years, and especially for more than 20 years, I've been working with pregnant and parenting team, and I had experience from different communities. Here in California, I have more contact with southern Mexico and Guatemalans than others communities. And part of what's happened when they come and they establish in the United States is their parents most likely they follow and continue with their own tradition and language. But the children has that mix because they have the influence at school of the English and also the dominance, hegemonic society here that impose them celebrations that are foreign to them. One example is the Halloween, for example. In all the school, they ask the children to dress up and go to Halloween. That is foreign for a lot of communities, indigenous communities especially, and not necessarily mestizo, but more indigenous community. Then when they come, it's something that they don't understand because the concept of the ancestors and death and life is a complete different connotation that here this society has. Um, you know, it's more scary the Halloween than really celebrating their ancestors. Then that is something foreign, but they starting to adopt that, and that create a conflict. Most of the situation is that a lot of these children are, raising themselves with that cultural conflict between them, and they will decide as soon they become older which one they will prefer. And I will give you a fast example. There's a Quiche who wrote an article, and you can find it in your Google. Um, right now, I forgot his name, but he got his PhD also in I think he was applying for a position in Cal State LA, by the way. But his last name is Bat. He's a Quiche who born here in the United States, and growing, here, he found that conflict, and he preferred to speak English than their own Quiche language or Spanish. He didn't speak at all Spanish, and he got offended when people approach him, speaking Spanish. Then as soon he become more adolescent, he's starting to see that conflict more. Then he decided to learn Spanish too, because of that, a lot of clash with people. But then as soon he finished high school, he went back to Guatemala and exposed again to his own community, starting to create that desire, and he decided to learn his Maya Quiche's ways too. Then now that studying as a PhD, he has the opportunity to go back as a PhD student to work in Guatemala with his own communities Um, and that create a different situation. Then he said he as a Quiche born in the United States, he's proud of the Quiche he is. And now he is learning again the Quiche, and the ways the Mayas are. But he has also the knowledge of the Occidental way. Then it's something that you will find in a lot of children here. They're gonna grow up with that. And one important thing is you're gonna find indigenous people born or coming in a younger age here that get their degrees. They become doctors, they become lawyers, and they have the knowledge of their own culture too. Then those are things that could be used as a bridge with these communities working here in the United States, because these are professional who understand the ways that the United States are, and at the same time, they understand their own communities. Then that is important to have in mind that children will be that bridge in the future, and respect, the parents when they trying to deal with the situation of the children, and don't use too much the children as a translators, because sometimes they will not translate what they don't want to translate to the parents. Whatever they say against themselves, they will not, or they will change it. Then use neutral translators in that sense. I don't know if that I explain or respond to the question.
Excellent. Thank you, Javier. We have one last question here. We want to be mindful of the time. We know it's almost 2:30. The question is, could you provide us with an example of how a traditional healer helps the indigenous people with mental health issues?
That's it's a hard question, because depending on what tradition we're talking about. You know, but I will give a fast example from my perspective as a Nahuatl person. It's depend. Part of our tradition is that we understand. Where when we born, we look at the moment you born and in which under which Nahual you were. I don't have enough time to explain all of this, but um, what people call calendars, indigenous calendars are not calendars, but let's use that term calendar, which is not right. But in the Cholk for example, if I'm born under the Nahual, which is path, there's some characteristics that happen to that person because born under that specific Nahual that the healer is going to look at, and by listening what the person is saying and telling and what's happened is going to look at the Nahual, and based on that will provide certain recommendations or treatments to do. The other thing is depending on how they perceive what is the situation. Some people will identify, in the majority of the cases, they will identify this is a mental issue. And in our communities, mental issues are real in the sense of, for example, there's an Nahual, we call it Imoj. Imoj is the Nahual that is related to the mental health, because is when you look at that. And probably this person is not to the Nahual, but it's gonna get a treatment, will be a treatment in that Nahual specific. The healer is gonna say, okay, in Mosh Day, come back, we're gonna do this. And part of the plática, like I said, the conversation is like a therapeutic session when, the healer asks the questions, how are you feeling? Why do you think you're feeling in this way? What's happened? If this happened before, and they can express what they have been experienced and even the healer will ask them, what do you think you experience this, and some people say, oh, I don't know if I'm getting crazy or I'm getting, the spirits are talking to me, then it's when the healer is gonna find the facts, and based on that will recommend, okay, that's what we can do. Let's see if this can work. Herbal medications or massages or anything, ceremonies, special ceremonies that can be done depending on the tradition. Then it's depending on each tradition. It's not, like I said, I cannot do a homogeneous recommendation to everyone because it depends on the tradition they come. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer, Javier, and thank you for your excellent presentation. And I want to thank everybody for your participation. We will also like to invite you to our next training that will be on August the 19th. We invite you to sign over for that. And your opinion is very important to us. Fill out the evaluation form. I have shared the link through the chat for your convenience. It only takes a couple of minutes, or just scan this code with your smartphone or click on the link below it. If you can't do it right away, an email will be sent to you with a link and your certificate of participation as a reminder. We want to thank you once again for being here. Have a great day.
Thank you so much for participating too, and thank you for being in. All of you has been in the different series of these presentations. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that we will see each other in the future.
Thank you, Javier.